I'm Bob Bradley. This is THE 101, Introduction to Theater and Drama Arts. My guest today is Dr. Michael Mauldin, who has come to the theater, who has come to this occupation of directing after a long and successful career as an actor in both the professional and academic world. And so we are very happy today to have him to talk about his function as a director. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay. I suppose we start with, okay, the director at least reads a script and makes a decision. Yeah. I've seen some productions when I wonder.
That's right. Did you actually read the script?
That's right.
Yes.
But you read the script, and at that point you say, yes, I want to direct this. All right. Now, how then now do you start, maybe the word is preparing and reading this script from a directorial standpoint? What do you do?
Of course, I think it depends on the production. It depends on the script, because I think that there are various different approaches I think work for different scripts, or at least that's what's happened to me in my progress, hopefully progress as a director, is that you don't treat every text the same way. If there is some uniformity, though, I think probably the first step that I take now, which is very different from when I started directing as a younger man, is that I spend some time just with the script, just me and the script, sometimes over a period of weeks, depending on how long you have. I think you can't really say that there is a method or an approach, or at least I've discovered there is not a way of doing it that will work for every text. If there is a constant now, however, I think what I tend to do is to try and spend as much time as I can before the rehearsals begin, even before I have any meetings with designers or technical people or any of the other creative staff involved in the production, reading and rereading, and most especially reflecting on the text when not engaged in it. I think it's very, very important, and I think this is a luxury we don't give ourselves very often, because we're so conscious of that clock ticking all the time, that we have to hurry up and get it done, is the real value of sort of pushing away from the text and just letting things simmer and stew for a while. And you know how it is when you have something in mind, or you're working on a project, and then suddenly you start seeing all these references all over the place to it, in the news, or a street sign, and you think, oh, well, this must be a sign about this project. But obviously it's just because your thoughts are centered there. But the first thing I think that I will do these days is I try to figure out what is it that compelled this playwright to create this play, other than the story. Basically, I guess the simple answer is, what does this play mean, other than what the plot is about?
Okay, when you say what the play means, at this point, are you talking strictly in terms of what you find in the script, or are you now going to outside sources?
Probably at the very beginning, it's just what's in the script.
Okay.
And that's an awfully good, that's a good observation to make, Bob. It really is. Because there are, the order of it, again, I don't think that there is a set way of doing it. But for me, what seems to work is that, first of all, it's the relationship I find with the script. What is the argument or arguments that seem to be foremost in the playwright's mind? What does he or she seem to be commenting on or have a problem with? And then, if it's a period piece, which I seem to be involved a lot in doing.
And maybe you should explain what you mean by period piece.
Period is non-contemporary. Is largely, although not always, but largely defined as pre-20th century. Although I think, depending on Well, I mean, you could even look at a production like Hair, I guess, as being a period piece in that a piece which is locked into a very distinct time and place, you know, so non-contemporary. So I guess one of the questions that I would ask about if a period piece, if I were engaged in doing it, is what, if anything, does this have to do or say to a contemporary audience and a contemporary audience in the specific geographical location where I might be directing it? Which I think those are valid questions to ask. I think we should always be saying, why do this? What's the importance of it? And frankly, this was something that I was very influenced by the late Bill Ball in his book, A Sense of Direction. And it's his advice, and I remember that being one of those sort of life-changing experiences, was reading that book and his advice of how he directs plays. And he advises that the first step when you're meeting with your designers, and certainly before you meet the cast, and you know, probably even before you cast the play, is having discussions about why is it important to do this production. Because up until then, I had always, as a director, and really this was the way I was trained as a director, that you always start out with a very with a vision or a concept in mind. Sometimes you even bring in sketches or you know, books and say, this is the, you know, these are the colors, these are the palettes that I'm talking about. I need 5 doors, I need a stairway, things like that. Ball says that will take care of itself. That really is, it's like blocking, and blocking is just moving actors around on stage. That generally takes care of itself if you're trained in it. The important thing is to get this consensus about what is the heart of this play. Why is it important? Why is it a mission that we are all involved in it, in this admittedly difficult process, and often seemingly impossible process of mounting a production in 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. And the latter would be a luxury these days. So his advice, and I have found it to be very, very solid advice, and it's one that I have followed ever since reading that book.
But I think, and you said a very important thing, not only why is this play important, but then you sort of, I won't, not reduced it, but at that point, but why to this audience?
Yes, exactly.
Why to this locale? Because what may be important and may be understandable to people, let's say, in New York
Yes.
and Broadway theater,
Yes.
is not necessarily going to be the same thing in Springfield, Missouri.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't mean that's a denigration of Springfield, Missouri.
Not at all, and because the inverse is true as well. Yeah. And I've seen this happen a great deal, is that very often plays that will come out of regional theater, which are about a particular topic, like the Kentucky Cycle. Very well-written play, beautifully produced, but when it went to New York, it failed miserably. Which again is nothing against the play. It's simply that play, or the story of that play, the characters of that play, and the concerns of that play seemed to be so far removed from the urban experience that it simply didn't speak to them. And I think it's a very important undertaking for not only the director and the stage manager and assistant director, if you have one, but also all the designers. And I would also include the actors in these discussions, and I know a lot of my director colleagues will disagree with a lot of my approaches to directing, and that's fine. Hopefully we're all different on it, so that the audience can be exposed to these different approaches to what we call theater. But I think that it's even important to get actors, once they are involved in the production after casting, their take on what is the purpose of doing this play at this time for the people of Springfield, Missouri, if it were going to be done here? What specifically might we be able to say, if anything? Because I think the problem is if you can't answer that, then it seems to me you have a real problem with the play.
Okay, let me back up slightly.
Sure.
How do you discover, or how do you decide what a play says or means? How did you arrive at that? Reading it, obviously, but how do you get to that point?
I think it's when one learns, when I learned, and again, this is just the process that works for me, to go beyond the plot and beyond the characters, and realizing that those are devices, those are tangible devices, and this is straight out of Aristotle. This is right out of the Poetics. This is nothing new. But for me, it was new when it finally connected. You know, when I went, oh, that's what you're talking about. You know, that you go, oh, duh. The older and more educated I get, the more I realize how stupid I am. You know, it's a wonderful journey to make.
Can you go back, what's straight out of Aristotle?
The idea of that character and plot are tangible representations of a deeper argument, or what he calls argument, a deeper thought of what a point that the playwright is either trying to make or trying to question. That these characters generally represent an idea. They are tangible representations of a philosophy, in a way. I mean, if we were to back up and say, look at something like Sophocles' Antigone. There are two main characters. There's Antigone, who's been trying to bury her brother who has been killed in a war, and there's her uncle Creon, who says, no, it's against the law to do that. I mean, simplified version. Yeah. But basically, what you've got are two characters who represent civil law and moral law, and the rightness of both of those. And I think once you start realizing that these characters, the idea that these characters represent, then that starts making everyone think of the piece as a whole, including, and I think this is very important, the actors. Because I think actors tend to think of themselves, think of their work on the character as being very isolated. I mean, I think that's a lot of our actor training, is we make it a very lonely kind of, you know, what can I bring to this, and how can I make this character distinct, and all of that. I think one of the things they rarely think about is, how do I fit in to the greater scheme of the machinery of this play? Why, in fact, was I written into this play? What do I represent? What argument do I represent? And that's what I think really starts making everyone involved in the production think of not only the piece as more important and vital, but also their own contribution to it as more important and vital. And again, if you don't have that, I don't know why you do it. If you don't have that sense, that I would say the moment that anyone involved, director included, starts thinking in terms of, oh, well, I've got to knock this one off, get out of it. Stop doing what you're doing. You're too tired, or something has happened, and that production is not going to be the kind of production that is going to make an audience sit up and listen and watch what you're doing with any sort of sense of vitality or engagement. So that I think is really the first method that I take these days. Now that differs from the way I began as a director, as a young man. Because again, usually I would come in with everything prepared and everything worked out, basically saying, this is how the production is going to look, this is what it's going to sound like, and this is also what it means. So your job, designers, actors, everyone involved, your job is to reflect my interpretation, or facilitate my interpretation of the text. To me, I mean, and I know that that's a perfectly valid way of approaching directing. It just doesn't happen to excite me anymore. because then I find it to be localized in one interpretation. And generally, if you have people who are willing to do that with you, generally they're always looking for you to approve or disapprove of what their idea is. And I find it to be very, I find it to be very stultifying for people's creativity. You know, I love being surprised by what an actor or a designer might bring to the rehearsal, because there's always that possibility that they're going to do something or say something or create something that you didn't know that this is what this play was about, when in fact, for me, that's what the rehearsal process has become in an ideal situation, is a process of discovery, not a process of repetition, to bring it up to an interpretation which I have already worked out in my mind.
So the discovery becomes a journey both for you and everyone working on the production.
Absolutely.
In some way.
Absolutely, absolutely.
How do you encourage them to enter into this process?
That's difficult, isn't it? It really is, especially I think the way that actors in particularly are trained these days, which I have found to be very, what's the word? They are receivers of interpretation rather than givers of passive, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. Very passive. So that they find that they often will wait for the director to give them what their interpretation is supposed to be. But that's why I think it's very important to start, again, for me, it has been very important to start the rehearsal process in this way, because for one thing, it surprises them. It never fails to surprise a cast. Sometimes they're disconcerted by it. It's not always positive, because they are not used to it. You know, it's that it's this idea of that's not the way you're supposed to start the rehearsal process. But the ones for whom it does work are very often surprised and often delighted at the very beginning of the rehearsal process, because what it seems to do is it gives them a sense of ownership of the piece, that it is in fact a co-creation, that it is in fact a creation and not just a replication of something. I frankly don't see, I mean, another director who's been a great influence on me, well, a great influence on 20th century theater, is Peter Brook, and particularly in his book, The Empty Space, he talks about 4 different kinds of theater, and in particular what he calls deadly theater. And that, to me, this idea of a director being the sole interpreter of the text and everyone around him or her simply mirroring that interpretation, is as deadly as the kind of theater that Brooke talks about just, you know, if there's a well, I'll use a play I directed as an example, Showboat. If there's a production of Showboat on Broadway, and then what you do is try to recreate that production as much as possible, because it worked up there, so it should work here. That's the same kind of deadliness that Brooke is talking about, is that because there is no creation involved in it. There is no interpretation. There's no personal involvement with either the director, the actor, or the designers. And so far, I've been very pleased with this approach as an artist. I can't say that it's always successful with audiences. And I can't say that I always care, because it's one of those things that you have to question now, why are we doing what we're doing? But so far, generally, I think audiences have been responding pretty well to it.
So you bring everyone in as, or at least you hope you bring them in as sort of co-creators together. Mm-hmm. How do you get them to begin working and thinking? What do you do then to?
I will generally start with a series of exercises and games, And I know at first they can seem somewhat random, but they are all generally very carefully planned to not only get the cast engaged in working with itself and sort of breaking the ice a bit. I mean, that's a big part of it, is just breaking the ice. I mean, that's the great luxury that we often don't have in this country, is working with a company of actors who have a history with each other. And so you don't need to go through that, sometimes week-long process of actors being able to trust each other so that they can make choices which are out of the ordinary and surprising and daring, in the same way that they need to be able to trust the director, that the director is not going to go, no, that's wrong. Now, unfortunately, in my mind, a lot of directors do that a lot, that, no, that's not the interpretation, or that's not the way I want you to do it, which again, I think just makes a very passive, cowardly actor. But I think it's a combination of these sort of exercises, which are not only geared to get the cast engaged and trusting each other, but they're also somehow connected with the text, even if the cast may not realize it at first. That all of these games and exercises and improvisations do have a method to them on how they build.
You have made this prior to the rehearsal.
Yes.
You have devised these games, these exercises, and you deliberately said, okay, this exercise is tied to something in the text that you...
I won't always say that at the beginning.
Right. I mean, that you in your own mind.
Right, exactly.
You may not say it aloud.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. But you make certain choices. Also, with the idea that sometimes it's not going to work. You may try an exercise or a game or something, and it is simply not working, and that's when you move on to something else. That either you haven't been clear, or they are simply not, it doesn't engage their interest. And I think that's where a director, I think that is one of the most important things a director can do throughout the entire rehearsal process, is keep everyone, particularly the cast, engaged. And it's one of the hardest things to do, because as a director, you become so distracted, particularly as the production gets nearer to opening. You're worried about the set and the lights and the costumes and all these other things going on. But I think that's one of the most imperative keys to directing, is how do you find each individual lock for each cast member, which is going to keep them engaged and creating what they're doing, rather than repeating. Because that's how they're trained. That's how we train, generally, both directors and actors. Yeah. That's what the rehearsal process is about, is I'm going to tell you the way it's done, and then we repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, And to me, that's just deadly. It's absolutely deadly. I mean, for the moment that someone goes, okay, let's set that, you can see actors' minds click off, because now it's easy.
It's done.
It's done.
And there's no reason to return.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the opening, I mean, after those sorts of discussions, which again I have almost always seen to be very beneficial for a cast of, what does this play mean? What do we want to say with this play to audiences in Springfield? Now, I think that's one of the most important questions to ask. When all of that has begun, then we'll start these exercises and games and things like that. For example, I think one of the most beneficial ones that I can use, it sounds, I know, very elementary. I mean, any actor in beginning acting will recognize this one, is just creating tableaus, creating with your body statues which represent something that this play is about. If it's about, I don't know, love versus fear, or honor over pride or whatever it happens to be, but taking some sort of intangible thought or theme or something like that, and then having them tangibly create it. Somehow that starts getting the ideas of the text physically into their bodies. Then the next step, and again, this will vary
So
depending.
what you're doing here is asking them for a visual manifestation of something which is an abstract idea?
Exactly, exactly. Which really seems to make that, because one, it means that they have to grapple with that idea. They have to understand just what does that idea mean in order for them to physically demonstrate it. So,
and this doesn't have to be rooted in reality or realism.
Absolutely not.
Yeah,
Absolutely not.
But somehow it is a physical manifestation
Yeah.
of what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is a much different process than having them talk about it or write about it. And there is great value to those other things as well, but I'm just saying this seems to be a very different kind of creative process that happens when one has to put their mind around what this abstraction means in order to make something tangible from it. Now, the benefit, the practical benefit of doing something like that, from a directorial standpoint, is that they may, in fact, be creating things which you as the director are looking 6 weeks down the road going, ooh, that's a good picture. Or I would never have thought of that moment, or that's something that I can use. That's a very interesting composition that I can put on stage that these actors have created for you. So it has benefits on several levels. Probably the most beneficial, I think, for the cast is that sense of, again, ownership and possession of the text. Because the next thing that I will generally do is then start working in the text. And now remember, this is before what I sometimes call official rehearsals begin. This is before we go into blocking and, character development. This is fundamental precursors to that kind of work. The next step I'll generally use, and usually I will do this, well, almost all the time I will do this with classical texts or texts which are very language-based, which again, a young American actors tend to have a real problem with sometimes because that's generally not a big part of their training, is to physicalize the text, is to take bits and pieces or one of the most beneficial exercises, and this I took from Tina Packer, a wonderful director who's the artistic director of Shakespeare and Company, and she uses this a lot, this idea of shadowing. That if you have a person playing a role, and this is before lines are memorized, that they will go through and they'll be improvising, the scenes or blocking, and and it's very important, I think, to always say that this is not about performance. What you're not doing is necessarily related at all to what the eventual product is going to be. This is a series of explorations. But then you have a person, usually another actor, shadowing them with the text, and they're basically feeding them the lines, line by line or thought by thought, so that completely releases that actor from any responsibility of performance or product. And it's an amazing, I've rarely not been amazed at what that kind of liberty will do to the actor in that kind of process when they're not worried about which way do I face and can you see me and can you hear me? It seems like play, but what it is developing an enormous knowledge of the text and the character and the relationships of that character in that actor from the get-go, from the very beginning of rehearsals. So after a period of time, generally of that kind of experimentation, and again, I think the director has to be always on guard or always observant to see what's working and what's not. If it doesn't work, toss it out. You know, if the games aren't working, don't do them. For me, if blocking isn't working for them, change it. You know, but unfortunately, again, I think a lot of directors are very set in, you know, this is the way it's got to be, and if it's not this way, or if you have a problem with it, you're wrong. I find that, I just find that reprehensible. I mean, and I frankly think that you can see the difference on stage. You can see when a director has been that way, because I think you get empty performances, sometimes very facile, but empty performances. But after this period of sort of getting to know, of introducing the cast to themselves and to the text and their characters to each other, then I think is when the work on when the proper rehearsals begin. You know, when the more traditional approaches to, now we're going to start experimenting with what might actually appear on stage. But, you know, again, it's going to depend on the production. You know, it's going to be, it's one thing to do this with a classical piece or a piece with a minimal set. It's another thing, although I did do this to some extent, with something like Showboat, you know, where you have this enormous technical, you know, you have a boat coming on stage and things like that. You have enormous extra actor factors on the stage, which you as the director also have to be aware of. You know, you're much more aware of things like ground plans and how many steps must be taken and what's flying in at the time and all of that. But I mean, now that I think of it, I did do a number of these kinds of early experimental works early in the rehearsal process, which again, I think facilitated the performers coming up with ideas which surprised me as a director, which I didn't know were in the text. Again, from a very practical standpoint, it also keeps the director engaged. And we don't talk about that much, is how easy it is for a director to become bored with the process. If everything is worked out, then a lot of times the director's work is done, and he or she becomes a traffic cop, you know, and that's really their job.
Before we get to the director and the traffic cop,
Yes.
Let's back up way back.
Okay.
What kind of research do you do? And obviously it's going to depend on each individual script,
Yeah.
but what kind of research do you do, and how much do you do, and what kind of work do you do along those lines, which then is removed from the actual text?
Yes, that's a very good and very contentious question, because there's certainly a school of thought, and a very valid school of thought, that everything you need to know about the production is in the script, and that's the only thing that you refer to, and that's fine. I happen to be of the other school. I do a tremendous amount of research on a production, and again, as you said, depending on the kind of text that it is, when it takes place, when it was written, you know, you have all these opportunities. I will generally, I don't know how many categories I'm going to break this down into, so I'll just sort of free think for a while here, but first of all, I will generally research, in no particular order of importance, critical commentary about the play itself, what other people have said about the text, and what other people have said about productions of the text, that I have found this to be very useful. On one level, you know, there may be an 18th century critic that serves as nothing more than a curiosity, that you can go, oh, isn't it interesting that they thought that about this play back then? Isn't that, I wouldn't have thought of that. You know, it doesn't mean that anymore, but isn't it interesting that that's what that audience got out of it? On the other hand, you know, you can read a critic and you can go, oh, I never thought of that. I never thought that that's what this play could be about, or that's what this character could be about. So I have found that to be absolutely imperative, in the same way that, and I guess this would be in the same category, that, say, if I'm doing a Shakespeare piece or something, I will also try to find what actors have said about playing these roles. And I have found that to be an unexpected treasure trove of information of, you know, Gielgud preparing for Prospero in his many productions of The Tempest or something like that, and just how he has changed in his, you know, and I find that to be a fascinating and sometimes surprising source of information that you stock away. Certainly, I think in another category is everything I can find out about the playwright and what may have promoted the playwright to write the play. If this play is part of a larger work in the play, often, you know, you can look at O'Neill and you can sort of see how most of O'Neill's work seems to deal with some sort of idea of family and what the family is. I mean, that seems to be something that haunts him in a lot of his work. And I think it's important that if you're directing something to get an idea of, okay, this seems to be a piece of a larger mission that this playwright seemed to have been on, and how does that inform how you're going to approach it. And then probably the last category is, you know, what trying to find out what the playwright he or she has said about their work, what impelled them, what compelled them. Is there something that they felt that they were upset about that they were addressing? Is this a nice nostalgic piece about their own childhood? Is it a longing back of something that they're after? Then you have, which can be great fun, I think, then you have the research to do on two historical contexts that you may or may not want to apply to the play. You certainly have the context in which the playwright is writing, the specific time and location that the playwright is coming from. It's kind of like, I mean, there's kind of a joke, but I take it rather seriously about Shakespeare, is that no matter where Shakespeare is writing about, if he's writing about, you know, Julius Caesar in Rome, or you know, if he's doing Measure for Measure and it's in Italy, he's always writing about Elizabethan London. No matter where his plays are set, he's always writing about London in there. And I think that's interesting information.
Yeah, and I have seen a production of Julius Caesar which was costumed in Elizabethan costumes.
Yeah, as most likely it would have been done in his time. Right. So that's the kind of research that is really interesting, is how might this play originally have been? Exactly, exactly. None of this sort of very, again, contemporary preoccupation we have with accuracy on stage. But to contextualize, say, well, for example, let's take Julius Caesar. So probably what I would do is I would say, all right, I'm going to look at Shakespeare's period in Elizabethan England, see what's going on, and then also I have to look at the period in which Julius Caesar is set, you know, that Roman period.
44 BC.
Exactly, and see what is going on there to get this understanding. After that's done, then, of course, the director always has the choice, sometimes rightly and sometimes maddeningly, to say, as Orson Welles did, to do his, was it Macbeth or Caesar that he put in Nazi Germany as part of the Mercury Theater? I think it was his Caesar.
That's Caesar.
It was Caesar, wasn't it?
Macbeth is the voodoo.
That's right, voodoo Macbeth, yeah.
The voodoo laid in Haiti.
Well, you know, he does his Caesar and basically staged it, taking place in, you know, mid-40s Nazi Germany. So then you have that sort of added research about the period that you might set it in. And again, I think what you're always looking for are resonances. You know, what is the combination of Shakespeare, Rome, and the Third Reich? What are those resonances that are being made by combining, implicitly or explicitly, those three areas of research going in there? It's like when someone wants to do Arthur Miller's The Crucible. I mean, certainly you would say, okay, I'm going to certainly research the Salem witch trials. But you've also got to be able to research the context of the Red Scare.
in the 1950s.
In the 1950s, that is compelling Miller to write this piece and set it rather ingeniously during the Salem witch trials. So, yeah, research is a major component for me.
Okay, let me throw out a term, and at this point I won't do anything other than say you frequently hear people refer to the playwright's intention.
Oh, yes, yes.
What do you do with the playwright's intention?
I find that very problematic. I truly do. And I was influenced by a professor of mine about this who really opened my eyes, or I think opened my eyes about it, is I think what he calls the arrogance of saying that you understand or you have the key to the playwright's intentions, when often playwrights can't even tell you what their intentions are. If I may, I'll give you an example from my history as when I was an actor in New York, and I was friends with a very good and rather well-known playwright who's no longer living. But I was often involved in sort of initial productions or sometimes initial readings of his plays. And he rarely attended rehearsals, rarely. And one time he and I were having dinner, and I said, "What's with you? Don't you care? Are you too lazy? What? Well, why don't you come to rehearsals?" And this is another one of those sort of life-changing moments that you can look back and your mind sort of opens up. And he said, "Michael, I'm the playwright. I write plays. I don't always know why I'm writing the play. That's your job to figure out. All of these subconscious, unconscious things that may be affecting my writing of the play." And he said, if I am there attending rehearsals, I'm going to be the definitive authority because I created the play. So whenever you have a question, you're going to turn to me and you're going to expect an answer. And whatever answer I happen to throw at you is going to be the interpretation. And he said, I love going to see opening nights of plays that I've written, and I sit there and I go, well, I didn't know I wrote that. And that wonderful surprise. Now, that is unusual, and it is unusually generous in a playwright. But I think that's why he was such a good playwright, is that idea of me thinking that I know what Shakespeare intended, or Aeschylus intended, or Neil Simon intended, for that matter, I think is terribly arrogant on my part to have the presumption to say to a cast, I have the key. I have the interpretation of this.
This, of course, gets to that great difference between the performing arts and literature and visual arts, because with the literature, when the writer finishes, it's finished. Now, it's up to the reader to make the decisions about what it means and where it goes, or when the painter finishes, but it's still there, it's finished. It's right. That's it. Yes. But in the performing arts, and of course specifically in theaters, we're talking about the playwright, that creation is not finished with the script. Yes. That playwright is now giving it to the theater artist who are going to be the deliverers to the audience here. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, becomes the major function of the director, and that is somehow or the other, whatever means it is, but somehow or the other, the director is the central person through whom this one production is going to be, I guess, funneled to the public in some way. Mm-hmm. Now, the director may use many different means of arriving at this, but whatever it is, these artists together, that is director and all the collaborators working with that individual, are now delivering it to an audience. And I don't think anyone ever believes that what they're doing at that point, this is the final say. This is it, because it isn't. And in fact, if this group of artists were to return 10 years later.
Exactly.
They would not do the same production they had done 10 years earlier.
It's a real problematic, and I think it's a wonderful problematic to think about, is who has interpretational rights to the text. Because on the one hand, I can certainly see a playwright like Beckett or Albee,
Yes.
you know, who will go, look, this is what I wrote. You're either going to do that this way, or I'm not going to give you the rights to it. I can understand that. I can see that point. On the other hand, I can see a director going, but you know, I found a way of opening up this text in unexpected ways, and this was written 30 or 100 or 200, 2,500 years ago, and I know that this meaning is different from what surely was originally intended, but this is a way of making it alive. So it's this constant and I think unsolvable problem, because I do see both sides very clearly. There's the famous story of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and someone going to Albee and going, I want to do an all-male version of it. And he said, if I wanted to have written an all-male version, I'm perfectly capable of having done so. I didn't. No, you may not. So one does see that point.
Or the production of Endgame at American Repertory Theater, and which did finally go on after protest from Beckett's agent, but they had to include in the program a note, and that is, Mr. Beckett does not approve of what has been done in this production.
And I think anyone who has tried to, if anything, I tend, to usually err or try to err on the side of the playwright, because I cannot write a play. I've tried and tried, and to me, the art and craft of playwriting is this mysterious alchemy that, as a director and as an actor, I feel very beholden to. Which again doesn't mean that I feel that I'm giving, the playwright's intentions, because I feel that that's so malleable and something often that playwrights don't even realize that they have one, when it's going on. The wonderful discoveries you can make in a text through a series of explorations, I feel really opens up the text in ways that hopefully will surprise even you, even the director. And this, I think, is a very important thing to consider, is the director is a relatively very new creature in the theater, or the director as we know it. And I'm not sure that it has been altogether a positive thing for the theater by insisting that the interpretation of the text rests often solely in one person, and then everyone else is there to reflect that. This is the received wisdom these days. Now, I do think that there are some current theater practitioners who are challenging that notion. People like Anne Bogart and Tadashi Suzuki and Michael Mayer and some extraordinarily exciting contemporary directors and acting teachers who are purposefully trying to challenge the authority of the director. And I think this is a healthy thing. I really do. I think it's an important thing for us to discover for several reasons. Probably foremost for me, and this probably belies my beginning as an actor, and really my essence as an actor, is that it has the possibility of re-empowering the actor as an interpretive artist on the stage. You mentioned that contemporarily, it's the director who has the interpretational rights. I think it can be argued pretty substantially that it may be that these days that interpretation has shifted from the director to the designer.
Oh, yes, very much so.
And that has become the major interpreter of how the text is going to be received.
Of course, one of the things that we find now, which certainly have led to some wonderfully exciting productions, is where director and designers seem to have been, well, from the beginning, collaborators.
Absolutely.
And the designs that come out of that kind of collaboration and where they lead the director.
That's the truth, isn't it? It really is. It's very exciting when you can't really see the line anymore about who thought of what, and particularly when they don't seem to care. You know, when they don't care, they don't remember, because they are thinking as one unit. And you do seem to see more and more of that of director-designer teams who are establishing, you know, sometimes a decades-long relationship of creativity. And yeah, it really is quite something to watch. Yeah.
The director, I guess I certainly believe and hope that most of all, I see the director as collaborator. And that doesn't, and that's exactly the word, that is collaborator with everyone who is working on the production, in some way encouraging each person to find his or her way into it.
Yes.
And in fact, there's nothing, I think, more exciting than having a problem, going home, poring over the text, begin to find clues, but then come back and don't say, don't hand it to them, but now say, let's go examine this scene.
Yes, exactly.
Now let's see what's happening in the scene, and asking everybody. And who knows, they may even find clues there that you hadn't thought of.
Precisely, but what you're talking about, and I mean, you and I have worked together a couple of times, as you being the director and me being an actor in the production, and frankly, your style of directing is my favorite. I mean, I love having you as a director, because we seem to complement each other very nicely in the ways that we work. But what you're talking about is so personality based. You know, it's because it's a way that you choose to work, and therefore it does work for you. It doesn't always work for the actors, all of the actors, because again, many of them have been trained or are being trained to say, my job is to do what the director tells me. And so if they have a director who is a facilitator rather than a dictator, they can sometimes be very lost. But I mean, that's the ephemeral nature of this thing that we call directing, is about just what is the director's job. Because I've certainly had directors who, throughout the entire process, they will go, you need to be louder. And then I've had directors on the other, you know, side of the scale who will say, no, you need to turn your head this way and lift your eyebrow that way, and that, you know, and it's not to say that any one is more right or more wrong than the other, but so much of it is so changeable and so malleable based on personality and taste.
I had an actor who, professional actor I worked with at one time, and who said to me, he said, you are the least threatened person I have ever worked with. And I think part of that comes from the fact that a director I worked with at the University of Illinois, who was a wonderful woman, and I absolutely adored her, and I worked with her as an assistant director and stage manager 3 different times, but I always remember that one of the things that she said, which I've never forgotten, is, I'll take a good idea anywhere I can find it.
That's right. That's right.
I am never ashamed of getting an idea from somebody.
Absolutely.
and I think that freedom is so wonderful.
So many directors do seem to be, and this is probably what originally drew me to it as a young man, was that sense of power. I mean, it's a very ego-inflating experience to know that you have all of these people waiting with bated breath to know what the interpretation is. You know, you've got the book up there as if you're some high priest. And it can be very intoxicating. But I think that when one reaches that level of, you know, what I consider to be enlightenment, is that, you know, none of us really know, when you really get down to it, none of us really know how to do theater. We have certain things that we enjoy. We know what works for us. We have certain tricks that we have been taught, or things that we've stolen that we've liked, but none of us have the answer. None of us have the way a certain text is supposed to be done. And I think when you do start realizing that, is that, well, this is our approach, this is what seems to work for us, then it does become much more relaxed, I think much more fun. And if you don't have that sense of fun, I mean, it is called a play for a reason, I think. If you don't have that sense of fun, then you also don't have the creativity, and you don't have, I mean, you know, those old tired trust exercises aren't just there to take up time. They are there, in fact, to allow actors to take risks and to do the unexpected, and sometimes to fall on their face. And I would say, you know, to any actor, designer, or director trying to go into something, my biggest advice would be willing to fail big. Yeah. You know, if you're going to go down in flames. That's the way to do it.
And that's one of the great beauties of going to see any theater performance, because yes, even in the actual performance itself, the good actor is taking a risk every night, yes, going out there in front of the audience and exposing him or herself in some way or the other to you, and that's the most exciting thing in the world.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.